Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we are going to talk about the Iranian Renaissance in the context of Zarathustra, the founder of the Zoroastrian religion. With me is Reza Jorjani, who is a member of the Faculty in Philosophy at the New Jersey Institute of Technology. He is also the author of a very important book called Prometheus and Atlas. Welcome, Jason.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Jeffrey.
It's a pleasure to be with you, too. I think of, in the Muslim world, two unique countries, Egypt and Iran, both of which had at one time a long history of pre-Islamic empires that had their own unique cultures and religions, to which many modern people still feel some sense of connection and attachment.
Indeed. The one significant difference between Egypt and Iran is that in Iran, the language of the ancient Persians has survived. The contemporary language of Iran, Farsi or Parsi, the Persian language,
yes,
is a direct descendant of the language of the ancient Persian emperors.
Mm-hmm. Whereas in Egypt, the Pharaonic language, the hieroglyphic language, is no longer used.
Indeed, and also demographically, Iran still remains partly Indo-European in terms of its ethnicity. Mm-hmm. We still have large stocks of ethnically Persian people there, whereas I think the ancient Egyptians have been all but wiped out.
Well, the ancient Persian Empire was conquered by Muhammad himself and his armies, and the country was forced to convert to Islam some 1,300 years ago. And yet, such a massive conversion doesn't occur without consequences and without people still finding ways to keep the older traditions alive.
That's right. The Islamic conquest of Iran was even more violent and catastrophic than the Christian takeover of the Roman Empire. We had events comparable to the burning of the Library of Alexandria, where when the Arabs first entered the Persian Empire, they set fire to libraries and destroyed all kinds of archaeological sites, ransacked universities, and so forth.
Well, Iran is also known as the one of the main homes of Shia Islam, a particular branch of Islam which is regarded by the other branch of Islam, the Sunni branch, as not even Islamic.
Yes, and for good reason, because if you look at some of the core teachings of Shia mysticism, or of Sufism in general, which need not necessarily be Shia, but which overlaps a great deal with the esotericism of the Shia faith, you see some doctrines that are clearly not Islamic in origin, and that would be considered heretical from the standpoint of the Quran or the tradition of Muhammad.
So these doctrines, would you say, are derived from Zoroastrian teachings?
Yes, they are, and we can very clearly trace this lineage. In the Persian Empire immediately before the Islamic conquest, the empire of the Sasanian dynasty, there was a revolutionary movement by the name of Mazdakism. It was named after a character called Mazdak, who wound up being employed by the Sasanian emperor Qavad or Qobad to enact reforms with the aim of establishing social justice. Mazdak was preaching a kind of socialism based on the idea of the mystical communion of human beings. He preached the redistribution of wealth, the establishment of egalitarian communities, and even free love. He wound up saying that monogamous relationships, especially in the context of a feudal society, really ensnare people in possessiveness and a kind of lust that's counter to spiritual development.
How interesting.
So it's very strange, actually, that someone comparable to a Roman Caesar endorsed this man's teaching as the true form of Zoroastrianism, as a legitimate development of Zarathustra's doctrine.
Well, was it?
Well, I think that too much emphasis is placed on the Parsi preservation of Zoroastrianism, the type of Zoroastrianism that the Persians who fled from the Arab conquerors to India preserved in the enclave of Bombay. This was the official Sasanian state religion. And what we see in Qobad or Kavad is the attempt to promote an alternative interpretation of Zarathustra's teaching. And indeed, if we look back at the Gathas, there's a great deal of emphasis on social justice and egalitarianism.
Well, what about free love?
I think the concept of love and spiritual communion, especially in the context of this emphasis on transparency, truthfulness, revealing one's inner self to one's fellows, lends itself to this religion of love that wound up surviving the Arab-Muslim conquest of Iran in the form of Sufism.
But the Sufis are not particularly known for advocating free love.
Well, Sufism is an esoteric teaching.
Yes.
And the esotericism of Sufism goes back to Mazdakism. Mazdak claimed that there's an esoteric core of religion and there are exoteric or superficial manifestations of religious doctrine that change in various times and places. And that essentially the core teaching of Zarathustra remains the same throughout various historical epochs, but that it has to be adapted to time and place and the readiness of various societies to accept the teaching and be calibrated to their level of understanding.
So, as I understand it, one of the things that the Sufis would teach is that conventional piety is not the same as an authentic spiritual development.
Yes, but the thing that makes Sufism so heretical from an orthodox Islamic standpoint is that a large part of what they consider conventional morality are the legal dictates of the Quran. And if you read the Quran through once carefully, you see that there's an emphasis on the unalterable and perfect character of this message, so that any innovation, bid'ah, is considered apostasy. So this fundamentally conflicts with Zarathustra's core teaching of progressive evolution and the development of understanding and the pursuit of wisdom.
So here you have an entire empire which is essentially forced by military overlords to change their worldview in dramatic ways. And, and they adjusted to that by developing esoteric teachings.
Well, the trajectory of this esotericism from the world of pre-Islamic Iran into the Islamic period is very clear. What happened was the Mazdakites were actually brutally suppressed by the Sasanian state as a heterodox form of Zoroastrianism. And they went underground. The movement was led at that point by Mazdak's wife, Khurramiyya, became renamed Khurram Din. Din means religion. And this Khurram Din actually took up the cause of partisan resistance to the Arab invasion. They became the insurgent fighters against the caliphate. So they holed up in northwestern Iran between Azerbaijan and the Caspian Sea. And they wound up waging an insurgent war against the Arabian Caliphate for about 150 years. It's when they lost that fight on the battlefield that they donned the cloak of Sufism. They occulted their ideas in an Islamic form so as to be able to survive persecution.
But if I understand you correctly, they were endorsed by one of the Persian emperors and then later on were rejected by a subsequent Persian emperor prior to the Islamic invasion.
Yes, and it's thought that because of how destabilizing Mazdak's revolution was. After all, he had the king open up the granaries, he broke up large harems, and liberated their women, as it were. So this was considered very destabilizing, and some people attribute the conquest of Iran by the Arabs to the fact that the Sasanian state had already been shattered by this Mazdakite revolution.
Now that's interesting. That's especially interesting. Well, another interesting development that we ought to talk about is something known as Arabic science.
Yes, once the caliphate established itself, any science that took place had to be written in Arabic because it was being commissioned by the caliphate. Now, I know I mentioned this briefly, but it bears repeating that when the Arabs first invaded, they burned all the libraries to the ground. These were not people interested in science and learning. It took them about 100 years to realize that you can't run an empire that way. And so they pieced together whatever fragments of knowledge had survived. In the Sasanian period, Khosrow Anushiravan in particular had taken in the Platonic academicians who were fleeing from the closures of the academies by the Christians who had taken over the Roman Empire.
Europe was entering into a dark age at this point.
During the Byzantine period, the last of the classical European academicians fled to Iran. And you had at the University of Gundashapur and other places a European-Iranian fusion of classical science take shape. And this was largely wrecked by the Arab conquerors, but fragments of it were reassembled, and certain scholars were commissioned to continue this project of translating Greek texts now into Arabic instead of into Persian, as in the Sasanian period. But the majority of these scholars, like Razi, Biruni, Avicenna or Ibn Sina, Omar Khayyam, Khwarazmi, they're all ethnic Persians who are mostly from northeastern Iran, the part of Iran furthest from the seat of the Arabian Caliphate.
And it was these writings in Arabic by Persian scholars that eventually made their way into Europe and became the basis for the European Renaissance.
And what Westerners need to understand is that these scholars, scientists, were writing at a time when the population of Iran had hardly been converted to Islam. Their own grandfathers were Zoroastrians. And the part of Iran where they were based was subject to repeated revolts against the caliphate and attempts to establish semi-autonomous fiefdoms. So, to attribute this renaissance of classical scientific knowledge to Islam is somewhat of a historical travesty. It survived despite Islam and represents a kind of afterglow of what the Sasanian Empire could have accomplished.
And yet it led to an enormous flourishing within Europe. When we use the term Renaissance, it means something of such magnitude in European culture that the ripples have extended for centuries.
Yes, and it's interesting that today, as the genealogy of the pre-Islamic Persian mysticism and pre-Islamic Iranian science is being traced back to the Sasanian period, the name for this organic cultural awareness in Iran is the Iranian Renaissance.
Today,
it's been observed that a renaissance is taking place in Iran that is reconnecting the country to its pre-Islamic heritage by excavating Zoroastrian ideas from out of the Sufi mystical tradition and from out of Iranian science in the Middle Ages.
Now, I don't think most of our viewers or most Westerners in general are aware of this. When we hear about developments inside the Islamic Republic, it seems to be more and more a reversion to orthodoxy.
Well, what has happened in the Islamic Republic is that a decade-long reform movement stretching maybe from the late 1990s up to the uprising of 2009 has met its end. People have become convinced that the Islamic Republic cannot be reformed. And part of this conclusion lies in the fact that for the first time, the Islamic Republic confronted Iranians with an orthodox form of Islam. And it allowed them to tease apart what Islam is on the one hand from what the Persians made out of Islam in order to be able to survive and preserve their pre-Islamic heritage.
Well, for example, under secular dictatorships such as that of the Shah of Iran, the country was nominally Muslim, but more tolerant, I suppose.
Yes, and I wouldn't call the Shah's reign a dictatorship. It was an authoritarian form of government, but I think it was based on the ideal of rightly guided kingship or philosopher kingship. I think the Shah had an aristocratic ideal of government, which goes back to the ancient Persian emperors and is something that influenced the idea of philosopher kingship in Platonism, for example. And so the Shah was trying to bring about an Iranian cultural renaissance from the top down. What has happened in the wake of the Islamic Republic is an Iranian cultural renaissance from the bottom up, a grassroots movement that promises to reshape, I think, the most significant society at the heart of the Islamic world.
And how is Sufism regarded today in Iran?
Part of what the Islamic Republic has done sociologically is to get particularly bright young Iranian people to recognize that some of the most compelling ideals in Sufism actually can be traced back to pre-Islamic Iranian traditions. And they are in significant conflict with Orthodox Islamic doctrine. By imposing that kind of ideology on Iran, namely Islamic fundamentalism, the Iranian people were challenged to rediscover the actual historical sources of the elements of Sufism that most deeply resonate with them, and I think most deeply resonate with Westerners. Rumi's religion of love, Rumi's religion of love that lies beyond the valley of all cults and religions.
There are many great mystical poets from the Islamic period of Iran.
Yes, there are. And if you look at some of their utterances, like, for example, a few verses from Hafez, where he says, should sorrow send forth an army, the wine-bringing friend and I shall conspire to scale the dome of heaven and draw down a new design. Well, this is terribly heretical from an Islamic standpoint. First of all, the friend reference there, Sari, is a reference to Mithras. And Mithras, the wine bringer. Wine was used in communion rituals in Mithraism. And the idea that you would scale the dome of heaven and usurp God's place to remake the world as a paradise, well, that's not Islamic in origin and is one of many examples of pre-Islamic beliefs surviving in the context of Sufism.
Well, Hafez is greatly revered today in Iran, would you say?
Hafez's tomb in Shiraz was like an Iranian Mecca until recently. I say until recently because now the tomb of Cyrus the Great has assumed that position in the eyes of the youth. They gather spontaneously by the thousands around the tomb of Cyrus, and the Islamic Republic is terrified of this.
But earlier, if I heard you correctly, you seemed to suggest that the Islamic Republic has a certain amount of tolerance for the Iranians today to look to their pre-Islamic history with some degree of reverence.
Actually, I think they do it only because they have to. They know that the more pressure they apply on young people who are trying to reconnect with their pre-Islamic heritage, young people who wear this symbol as a pendant around their necks, and who celebrate very boisterously ancient Persian holidays, the more this cultural revolution is going to turn into a political revolution.
Let's talk about that symbol. It's a winged disc, is it not?
It's a symbol of the progressive evolution of the soul. It, in pendant form, has become a predominant symbol among the Iranian youth. You see it everywhere. Iran is probably the youngest country in the world. 70% of the population is under the age of 30. And I would say that a significant percentage of those young people have now converted out of Islam and back to some form of Zoroastrianism.
Well, you mean, I presume you don't mean officially.
Well, if they were to officially convert out of Islam, the penalty for that would be death in the Islamic Republic. Conversion out of Islam is considered apostasy and punishable by death. Also, an important point there is that the Parsis, the preservers of Zoroastrianism in Bombay, do not accept converts. This is a function of the extreme persecution that they faced. They became a very closed community for good reason. This is how they were able to keep alive the Zoroastrian liturgies in their pure form. So the youth in Iran today are not filling out membership forms to join Parsi temples in Bombay. And I think that a century from now, when Zoroastrianism returns as a thriving cultural movement, I think it will have returned more through the Iranian Renaissance than through any adaptation of the Parsi preservation of Zoroastrianism.
Now, I believe the Sufis have a symbol that's similar to that, a heart with wings.
I think there are various permutations of that symbol, yeah.
It almost looks a bit Egyptian.
Yeah, the ancient Persians, were very syncretistic. Herodotus says that the Persians adopt everything that they like from another culture. They don't care what its origins are. Whatever they think is best from a culture other than their own, they appropriate and adapt. This is a reflection of Zarathustra's teachings. And you see this in ancient Persian art, in particular in this symbol. It has Assyrian and Egyptian elements to it.
So, if we consider today the Iranian Renaissance as being somehow parallel to the European Renaissance, it would imply a huge cultural flourishing.
Yes, and the Iranian Renaissance also considers Iran as something far greater than the present nation state. In the Sasanian period, the country was referred to as Iran Shahr, which is a Middle Persian form of Aryana Khashatra, meaning Aryan Imperium. The ancient Persians never referred to their empire as the Persian Empire. They always called it Aryana Khashatra, or Iran Shahr. Persians was a designation that the Greeks adopted for all of the Iranian peoples. It leaves out the Kurds, who are an Iranian people, but not Persian.
In other words, they're not Persian because they don't speak the Persian language.
Yes, it's like, all Italians are Europeans, but not all Europeans are Italian. And so the concept of Iran in the Iranian Renaissance is a concept of a greater Iran, which extends into Afghanistan and Central Asia to the east, and then into Iraq and Syria and the Kurdish part of Turkey in the west. So an Iranian Renaissance could also offer the possibility of profound cultural transformation in those regions as well. And particularly in Central Asia, the Tajik Persians of Afghanistan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan value the Shahnameh, the Persian epic, the Persian Book of Kings, as highly as Persians in Iran do. Many of the core ideas of the Iranian Renaissance are being drawn from out of the pages of the Shahnameh, which Ferdowsi composed right after the Arab conquest, about a century and a half after the Arab conquest, as a way of preserving the Zoroastrian tradition.
Well, the Zoroastrian tradition, as you've pointed out, differs from the Islamic tradition in one fundamental way at least, which is the idea of progress, that whereas the Quran is supposedly eternal and unchangeable, Zoroaster proposed a constant progress of society towards a utopian ideal.
Yes, there are three core ideas that the Iranian Renaissance is developing from out of Ferdowsi's 10th century Epic of Kings, the Shahnameh. And the foremost of them is the worship of wisdom, Setayesh Kherad, which is Zarathustra's core principle. And so the idea is that society has to be based on the reverence for wisdom and a just political order. The establishment of social justice, or daut, should be based on the pursuit of wisdom and guided by people who are seekers of truth. This is a political form that is not democratic. It doesn't believe that everything should be decided by an absolute majority of society. It's very similar, actually, to Plato's philosophy of how a utopian city-state ought to be governed.
Well, it sounds very similar to Western humanism that evolved out of the Renaissance in Europe.
Well, it's similar to Renaissance humanism, yes, the humanism of the Medicis, more so than late modern humanism. And so I had mentioned the reverence for wisdom and concern for social justice, ستایش خرد and dod. And the last of the Zoroastrian principles that the Iranian Renaissance is excavating from out of the Shahnameh in particular is abadsazi giti, or the beautification and cultivation of the world. The idea that we can improve upon nature and that we should continually strive to develop more sophisticated society and increase the level of civilization and industriousness. This is an ethos very conducive to dramatic advancements in science and technology. The same ethos that was at the basis of the so-called Islamic Golden Age.
Well, another point that you raised in a previous interview is that the Zoroastrian teachings are one in which women are regarded as the equals of men.
That's right, and in the pages of the Shahnameh you see very strong women who are in positions of authority. You see even female champions, female knights, basically. The term pahlavan or knight doesn't necessarily refer to a man in chivalric culture of ancient Iran, which in a previous interview we discussed spread into Europe from the area of Ukraine where the Germanic tribes were traveling into Europe with the Scythians. So in the Shahnameh you see women taking on positions that in most traditional societies are exclusively reserved for men.
And I know you mentioned in our previous interview that this is related to the Grail legends that permeated Christian culture.
Yes, I believe that there's good evidence the Grail mysticism of Europe was brought into Northern Europe and down into Occitan, southern France and Spain by the Sarmatians and the Scythians who were traveling with the Germanic tribes.
Well, I hope someday we can do an interview on that subject, Jason, but for now our time is up. This has been a very enlightening half hour. Thank you for being with me.
It's been a real pleasure being with you again, Jeffrey.
And thank you for being with us.